The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when the Duke of Ashworth found her. Not a gentle snow, not the kind that dusted rooftops and made the countryside look like something painted on a holiday card. This was the kind of snow that buried roads, snapped tree branches, turned the whole world into a white and howling nothing. The kind that killed people who did not have the good sense to be inside. It was nearly midnight when the groundskeeper, old Barrow, came pounding on the study door with his face the color of chalk and his hands shaking so badly he could barely speak. "Your Grace," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "There is a woman at the gates." Sebastian Hale, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, looked up from the letter he had been reading. A letter from his solicitor in London, filled with numbers and obligations, and all the dull machinery of keeping an estate alive when the man who owned it had no particular interest in being alive himself. He was 31 years old, and he looked older. Not from age, from something else. Something that had settled behind his eyes 2 years ago and had not left. "A woman," he repeated. His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who had trained himself to react to very little. "She is on the ground, Your Grace, outside the iron gate. She is not moving much." Sebastian was on his feet before Barrow finished the sentence. They found her in the snow, curled against the base of the great iron gate, like something the storm had deposited there along with the broken branches and the drifts. She was wearing a dress that might once have been blue, but was now so soaked and frozen it was nearly black. No coat, no gloves, no hat. Her hair, dark and tangled and crusted with ice, was spread across the snow around her head like a stain. Her lips were the wrong color. Her fingers were the wrong color. Her skin, where he could see it, was so pale it was almost transparent, like paper held up to a candle. She was still breathing, barely. Shallow little puffs of fog that disappeared almost before they formed. Sebastian knelt in the snow beside her. The cold bit through his trousers immediately, sharp as teeth, and he did not care. He pulled off his coat, the heavy wool one lined with fur that had cost more than most families earned in a year, and wrapped it around her. She weighed almost nothing when he lifted her. That was the thing he remembered later, the thing that stayed. How light she was. How it felt less like carrying a person, and more like carrying something the wind might take from his arms if he was not careful. "Open the house," he said to Barrow, and his voice was no longer flat. It was something else entirely. He carried her up the long drive, through the snow that reached his knees in places, past the ancient oak trees that lined the approach to Ashworth Hall like sentinels guarding something that no longer deserved guarding. The hall itself rose ahead of them, enormous, dark, every window unlit except the one in his study where the lamp still burned. It was a house that had once held laughter, music, the sound of footsteps on marble, the smell of fresh flowers in every room. Now it held silence and dust, and the echoes of a man walking alone through rooms too large for one person. He brought her inside. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, appeared as if she had been summoned by some force beyond the physical. A stout woman in her 50s with iron-grey hair and the kind of face that suggested she had seen everything the world could offer and had decided most of it was foolishness. She took one look at the woman in Sebastian's arms, and her expression shifted from irritation at being woken to something fierce and focused. "The blue room," she said. "I will have a fire built immediately. Barrow, hot water, not boiling, warm. Do you understand? Warm. And blankets, every blanket we have." Sebastian carried the woman up the staircase. He was aware of the way her head lolled against his shoulder, the way her frozen hair pressed against his neck, the way her breath came in hitches as if even the act of breathing was something her body was considering giving up on. He was aware of these things in a way that felt dangerous, because he had spent 2 years being aware of as little as possible. He laid her on the bed in the blue room, and Mrs. Calloway descended like a general organizing a campaign. Blankets were piled, hot stones wrapped in cloth were placed at her feet. Her frozen shoes, if you could call them shoes, more like slippers, ridiculous in this weather, meant for a ballroom, not a blizzard, were removed, and Mrs. Calloway's face tightened when she saw the state of the woman's feet. "She has been walking for a long time," she said quietly, more to herself than to Sebastian. "In this storm. In these." Sebastian stood by the door, watching. He should leave. This was not his place. Mrs. Calloway and the maids would care for her. He had done what any decent person would do. He had brought her inside. He should leave. He did not leave. Because when Mrs. Calloway gently brushed the frozen hair away from the woman's face, Sebastian saw it clearly for the first time, and the floor beneath him seemed to tilt. He knew that face. He knew the exact curve of that jaw, the specific way the cheekbones caught the firelight, the small scar just above the left eyebrow that looked like a crescent moon. He knew the precise distance between the nose and the upper lip, the shape of the closed eyelids, the way the brows arched, not in surprise, even in unconsciousness, but in something that looked like a permanent, quiet question. He knew that face because he had looked at it every day for a year. In a painting that hung in his study, that he had purchased at auction 18 months ago for a price so absurd the auctioneer had blinked 3 times before confirming the bid. A painting of a woman he had never met, by an artist whose name no one remembered, dated 1868, 24 years before this night. The woman in the painting was wearing a green dress and sitting in a garden and looking directly at the viewer, with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite sadness, but something in between. Something that said, "I know something you do not, and it is both wonderful and terrible." The woman in the bed was wearing a frozen blue dress and lying unconscious in a room that smelled of wood smoke and lavender, and she was, feature by feature, line by line, the same woman. Which was impossible. The painting was 24 years old. The woman in the bed could not be more than 25. The mathematics did not work. The logic did not work. None of it worked. And yet... Sebastian gripped the doorframe so tightly that the wood groaned under his hand. "Your Grace," Mrs. Calloway said, glancing at him, "you should change. You are soaked through." He looked down. He was soaked. The snow had melted into his clothes and pooled on the floor around his boots. He was shaking, though whether from cold or from something else, he could not say. "When she wakes," he said, and his voice came out wrong, rough and strange, like a door being opened for the first time in years, the hinges protesting. "When she wakes, I want to be told immediately." Mrs. Calloway studied him. She had been in this house for 23 years. She had watched Sebastian grow from a serious, quiet boy into a serious, quiet man. She had watched him marry. She had watched his wife die. She had watched him close himself off from the world like a man boarding up windows against a storm that would never end. In 23 years, she had learned to read the Duke of Ashworth the way some people read weather, by the pressure in the air, by the direction of the wind, by the small shifts that predicted large changes. Something had shifted. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. He left, but he did not sleep. He went to his study, still in his wet clothes, and he stood before the painting. He looked at the woman in the green dress, at her almost smile, at her knowing eyes, at the crescent scar above her left brow. He looked at her for a very long time. Then he sat down in the chair before the fire, and he waited. She woke at dawn. Mrs. Calloway was the one sitting by the bed when the woman's eyes opened, a fact that later seemed important, because Mrs. Calloway was the kind of person who noticed things, and what she noticed first was the fear. Not ordinary fear, not the confusion of someone waking in a strange place. This was deeper, wider, the kind of fear that comes from reaching for something that should be there and finding nothing, like reaching for the ground and finding empty air. The woman's eyes were brown, not dark brown, not light brown, the precise, warm brown of autumn leaves when the sun comes through them. They opened, and they looked at the ceiling, and they filled immediately with something so raw and unguarded that Mrs. Calloway, who had been a housekeeper for 23 years and prided herself on maintaining a professional distance from every situation, had to press her hand against her own chest. "You are safe," Mrs. Calloway said. "You are in Ashworth Hall. You were found at the gates last night. You are safe." The woman turned her head. She looked at Mrs. Calloway. She opened her mouth, and then she closed it. And then she opened it again. And what came out was not a word, but a sound. A small, broken sound, like glass stepping on glass. "Can you tell me your name, dear?" Mrs. Calloway asked, keeping her voice steady, keeping her hands still, keeping everything about herself as calm and solid as a stone wall for this woman to lean against. The woman stared at her. Her mouth moved. Nothing came. She tried again. Her brow furrowed. And there it was, the crescent scar, catching the early light exactly the way it did in the painting. And she pressed her hands against the blankets as if trying to anchor herself to something physical, something real. "I don't," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw, and it trembled like a leaf in wind. "I don't know." "You don't know your name?" The woman shook her head. And then, slowly, with a horror so quiet it was almost soundless, her hands came up to her face. She pressed her fingers against her own cheeks, her own forehead, her own jaw, as if checking that the face was real, that it was there, that it belonged to her, as if she was not entirely sure. "I don't know anything," she said. Mrs. Calloway went to the study. Sebastian was still in the chair. He had changed his clothes at some point during the night. He was in dry trousers and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, no waistcoat, no cravat, which for the Duke of Ashworth was the equivalent of appearing in public in his undergarments. His hair was disarranged. His eyes were red-rimmed, but sharp. He looked like a man who had spent the night thinking very hard about something and had arrived not at an answer, but at a deeper and more complicated question. "She is awake," Mrs. Calloway said. He stood immediately. "She does not know her name," Mrs. Calloway continued, watching his face. "She does not know where she came from, how she arrived here, or anything about herself. She is frightened, but she is composed. She is polite. She asked if she was causing trouble." Sebastian said nothing. "Your Grace, the woman does not know who she is." "I know," he said. And then, more quietly, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere he had not intended to open, "Neither do I." Mrs. Calloway did not ask him what he meant. She was wise enough to recognize when a man was not speaking to her, but to himself. He went to the blue room. He knocked. He waited for a voice that said, "Come in." And even those two words, even scratched and faint and uncertain, sent something through him that he was not prepared for. A recognition. Not of her voice specifically, he had never heard her voice, but of something in it, some quality, some frequency that matched a frequency inside himself that he had forgotten existed. He opened the door. She was sitting up in the bed, propped against the pillows Mrs. Calloway had arranged. The blankets were pulled to her chest. Her hair, no longer frozen, had dried into dark waves that fell past her shoulders, and her skin, now warmed by the fire that had been burning all night, had shifted from deathly pale to the softest ivory. Her hands were wrapped in bandages where the frostbite had begun its work, and she held them in her lap carefully, as if they were borrowed things she was afraid of breaking. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the thing that happened in that moment was not dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no rush of music, no sudden blinding light. What happened was quieter than that, and because it was quieter, it was more devastating. What happened was that Sebastian Hale, who had spent 2 years building himself into a fortress of silence and duty and controlled indifference, looked into this woman's brown, autumn leaf eyes and felt every wall he had constructed crack. Not fall, not yet, but crack. Hairline fractures running through stone that had taken years to lay. The kind of cracks that cannot be repaired because the foundation itself has shifted. "I am the Duke of Ashworth," he said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man standing on ground he does not trust. "You were found at my gates last night, in the storm. You are welcome here for as long as you need." She studied him, despite the fear, and the fear was still there, he could see it, a living thing behind her eyes, coiling and uncoiling. She studied him with an attention that felt almost physical, as if she was reading him the way a scholar reads a text in a language they are still learning, carefully, thoroughly, missing nothing. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a pause, "I am sorry I cannot tell you who I am. I want to. There is a place where that information should be, and it is simply empty, like a room someone has cleared of all its furniture." He was not prepared for that. Not for the precision of it, not for the metaphor, not for the way she described her own absence of self with such clarity that it revealed, by contrast, the sharp intelligence still intact beneath the amnesia. She did not know who she was. But whoever she was someone who thought in images, who spoke with exactness, who faced the void where her identity should have been, and described it rather than dissolving into it. "The doctor will come this morning," he said. "In the meantime, Mrs. Calloway will see to anything you need." She nodded. Then she tilted her head, just slightly, and said, "You are looking at me as if you know me." The crack in his walls widened. "Rest," he said, and left. The doctor came. Dr. Ellis was a round man, with kind eyes and careful hands, who had been treating the Ashworth household for 15 years. He examined the woman thoroughly, her frostbitten fingers, which would heal, her feet, which were blistered and raw but would also heal, her lungs, which were clear despite the exposure, and her memory, which would not cooperate no matter how gently he prodded. He sat with Sebastian in the study afterward, drinking tea and choosing his words with the precision of a man who knows that what he says next will determine the shape of someone's life. "The memory loss is real," he said. "I have seen it before, though rarely. A severe shock, physical, emotional, or both, can cause the mind to simply close a door. Everything that was behind that door still exists. She has not lost who she is. She has lost access to who she is. Will it return? Sometimes it returns all at once, like a dam breaking. Sometimes it returns in pieces. A smell, a sound, a face triggers a fragment, and the fragments slowly accumulate until the picture is complete. And sometimes," he paused, "sometimes it does not return at all." Sebastian absorbed this. "There is something else," he said, and rose from his chair. He crossed to the painting. He had turned it to face the wall during the night, an act that felt both necessary and cowardly, and he had spent an hour afterward trying to decide which it was. He turned it around. Dr. Ellis looked at the painting. Then he looked at Sebastian. Then he looked at the painting again. "Good Lord," he said. "The painting is dated 1868, Sebastian said. 24 years ago." Dr. Ellis stood and approached the painting. He examined it closely. The brushwork, the canvas, the small brass plate on the frame that bore only the date and no name. "This is uncanny," he said. "The resemblance is extraordinary. But, Your Grace, it must be a relative, a mother, perhaps, an aunt. The painting is clearly of a woman in her 20s. The woman upstairs is also in her 20s. The ages cannot align." "I know. The likeness is remarkable, but such things are not unheard of. Children often bear a striking resemblance to their parents." "A striking resemblance," Sebastian repeated. Look at the scar." Dr. Ellis looked. Above the painted woman's left eyebrow, there was a crescent-shaped mark, small, precise, distinctive. "The woman upstairs has the same scar," Sebastian said. "Same shape, same position, same size." Dr. Ellis was quiet for a long moment. "Scars can run in families," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "If the same incident, a fall from a horse, a childhood accident, occurred in similar fashion to both mother and daughter—" "Doctor." "Yes, Your Grace. You do not believe what you are saying." Dr. Ellis took a long drink of his tea. "No," he admitted. "I do not." They agreed, because there was nothing else to do. Because the alternative was to stand in front of an impossible painting and an impossible woman and simply refuse to function. That the most practical course of action was to identify the woman through normal means. Sebastian would send word to the nearby villages. He would contact the authorities. He would make discreet inquiries. Someone, somewhere, would be looking for a missing woman. Someone would know her name. In the meantime, she would stay at Ashworth Hall. In the meantime, everything would change. The first week, she kept to the Blue Room. Not because she was told to. Sebastian had made it clear she was free to move about the house as she wished. But because the world beyond that room was a world in which she did not have a name, and the room, at least, was a defined space, a boundary she could comprehend. She could learn the room. She could map its dimensions, memorize the pattern of the wallpaper, count the books on the small shelf by the window, learn the precise time each day when the sun reached the glass and threw a rectangle of light across the floor. Mrs. Calloway brought her meals. They talked, or rather, Mrs. Calloway talked, about the house, the village, the weather, the particular temperament of the kitchen cat, a fat orange animal named Nelson, who had never, to anyone's knowledge, caught a single mouse and seemed to consider this a point of pride. And the woman listened. She listened with the same focused attention she had given Sebastian, and Mrs. Calloway, who was not a woman easily charmed, found herself charmed. "She is sharp," Mrs. Calloway reported to Sebastian at the end of the first week. "Whatever she has not lost her wits. She asked me about the history of the house. She asked about the grounds. She asked about the tenants and whether they had enough food for the winter. She's been reading the books from the shelf. She finished 3 in 4 days. And she asked about you." Sebastian, who had been reading a ledger, did not look up. What did she ask? She asked why the house was so quiet. He did not respond to this. She asked if you lived here alone. Still nothing. She asked about the portrait in the hall, the one of you and Lady Catherine. Sebastian's hand stopped moving. Lady Catherine, his wife, who had died 2 years ago in this house, in the room directly above the study, of a fever that had taken her in 4 days. 4 days. That was all it had taken. A cough on Tuesday, a fever on Wednesday, delirium on Thursday, silence on Friday. 4 days to dismantle everything he had believed about the permanence of love and the fairness of the world. "What did you tell her?" he asked, and his voice was very controlled, very even, which was how Mrs. Calloway knew it was costing him everything to ask. "I told her you were a widower," she said. "I told her Lady Catherine died 2 years ago. I told her you had been very much in love with your wife, and that her loss had been a great blow to you. I saw no reason to be anything other than honest." "No," he said. "There is no reason." He went to see her that evening. He told himself it was duty, the duty of a host checking on a guest, nothing more. He brought a book, a history of the county, which he thought she might find interesting given her questions about the house and the land. That was the reason. A book. A simple, practical, emotionally uncomplicated book. He knocked. She said, "Come in." He entered. She was sitting in the chair by the window, wearing a dress that Mrs. Calloway had found somewhere. Dove grey, simple, slightly too large for her frame, which made her look younger and smaller than she was. Her bandaged hands were resting on her knees. Her hair was braided now, a thick, dark plait that hung over her left shoulder, and the firelight caught the copper threads in it and made them glow. "I brought you this," he said, holding out the book as if it were a shield. She took it. She looked at the cover. "A History of the County of Ashworth and its Surrounds," she read aloud, "by Reverend Thomas Whitting." She looked up at him. "Is it any good?" "It is thorough," he said. "Whether it is good depends on your tolerance for Reverend Whitting's belief that every event in the county's history was personally arranged by divine providence." And she laughed. It was a small laugh, a short, surprised burst of sound that she immediately tried to catch, pressing her bandaged hand against her mouth as if she had broken a rule she did not know existed. But it was real, and it was warm, and it filled the room the way the fire's heat could not. Sebastian stood very still. He could not remember the last time someone had laughed in this house. He could not remember the last time he had said something that made someone laugh. The sound of it moved through him like light through a window, illuminating things he had not looked at in a long time. "I am sorry," she said, lowering her hand. "I do not know why that struck me as funny." "Because it is funny," he said. "Reverend Whitting once attributed a poor turnip harvest to the moral failings of the village blacksmith." She laughed again. This time she did not try to catch it. He should leave. He had delivered the book. His duty was discharged. "Would you sit?" she asked. "I've been alone all day, and Mrs. Calloway, wonderful as she is, has very strong opinions about the kitchen cat, and I have heard them all." He sat. They talked. About the book at first, then about the house. She asked him about the architecture, when the west wing had been added, why the east windows were larger than the west, whether the stone had been quarried locally. He answered. Her questions were specific and intelligent, and each one surprised him, because they revealed an understanding of buildings and their construction that she should not have had unless she had studied the subject, which meant something about her was surfacing, even if the memories themselves remained locked. "You know a great deal about architecture," he observed. She stopped. She looked at her own hands as if they might hold the answer. "I do," she said slowly. "I do not know how I know it. It is like... Do you know the feeling of reaching for a word that is right at the edge of your tongue? That is what all of it is like. Everything I know is right at the edge. I can feel the shape of it. I just cannot see it." "That must be maddening." "Maddening," she repeated, testing the word. "Yes, but also frightening. Because what if the things I cannot see are things I will not want to see when they return? What if I forgot for a reason?" He had no answer for this. Or rather, he had an answer, but it was too honest to give to someone he had known for a week, so he kept it behind his teeth. The answer was, "I understand. I have spent 2 years trying to forget, and I would give anything to succeed." Instead, he said, "Whatever you find, when you find it, you will not face it alone. You have my word." She looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 8, and the sound of it moved through the rooms like a heartbeat. "You are a strange man," she said quietly. "So I have been told." "You found a nameless woman in the snow, carried her into your home, gave her a room, called a doctor, and now you are sitting by her fire promising she will not face her demons alone. And you do all of this with the expression of someone who is enduring a great inconvenience." He almost smiled. It was such a near thing. The corner of his mouth moved, the muscles around his eyes shifted, that if she had blinked, she would have missed it. "It is an inconvenience," he said. I was quite committed to being miserable. I can see that. You are disrupting a very carefully constructed program of isolation and self-punishment. My deepest apologies. And this time it was his turn to almost laugh. A single exhaled breath, barely audible, but she heard it, and the look that crossed her face was something he would remember for the rest of his life. It was surprise and warmth and recognition, as if she had found something she had not known she was looking for. He left shortly after. He went to his study. He turned the painting back around and stood before it again. And this time, the woman in the green dress was looking at him with an expression that he now understood was not mysterious at all. It was the exact expression the woman upstairs had worn when she'd heard him almost laugh. He sat down. He pressed his hands against his face. He said to the empty room, "What is happening to me?" The inquiries yielded nothing. Sebastian's letters went out to every village within 50 miles. No one was missing a woman. No family had lost a daughter, a sister, a wife. The authorities had no reports. The coaching inns had no records. It was as though she had materialized from the snow itself. A woman made of winter, deposited at his gates by a storm that had no business creating something so warm. 2 weeks became 3. 3 became 4. The blue room stopped being a guest room and started being her room, though no one said this aloud. She started coming downstairs for meals. The first time she appeared in the dining room, Sebastian was already seated, and he stood so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made them both flinch. "I thought I might eat here," she said, standing in the doorway, "if that is acceptable." The dining room at Ashworth Hall was designed for 30. There was one place set. It sat at the head of a table so long that a person at one end could barely see the expression of a person at the other. It was, she thought, the loneliest table she had ever seen. "Of course," he said. Mrs. Calloway, who seemed to materialize at moments of social crisis, the way some people materialized at the scene of a fire, had a second place set within moments. Not at the far end of the table, not even in the middle. She set it at the place directly to Sebastian's right, close enough to pass the salt without standing, close enough to speak without raising one's voice, close enough that if 2 people reached for the bread at the same time, their fingers might touch. Sebastian looked at the place setting. He looked at Mrs. Calloway. Mrs. Calloway looked back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, "I have been waiting for this for 2 years, and you will not ruin it." They ate together. The conversation was careful, polite. The conversation of 2 people who were intensely aware of each other's presence and were working very hard to pretend they were not. They discussed the weather. They discussed the book she had finished. She had opinions about Reverend Whitting's theological approach to agriculture that were precise and devastating, and that made Sebastian set down his fork twice because he was too engaged in listening to remember to eat. They discussed the grounds, which she had seen from her window but not yet visited. "When the weather breaks," he said, "I will show you the gardens. They are not much in winter, but in spring they are." He stopped. "They are what?" He was quiet for a moment. "They were my wife's," he said. "She designed them. Every path, every planting, every corner." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something. His grief, her attentiveness, the space between what he had said and what he had not said. "You must miss her very much," she said. "I do." "Will you tell me about her?" No one had asked him this. In 2 years, not a single person, not his brother, not his friends, not the endless parade of well-meaning acquaintances who had shown up in the months after Catherine's death, with casseroles and condolences, and the desperate need to say something helpful, had simply asked him to tell them about her. They had told him they were sorry. They had told him she was in a better place. They had told him time would heal. They had not asked him to describe the sound of her laugh, or the way she hummed while she worked in the garden, or the particular way she had of tilting her head when she disagreed with something, but was too polite to say so. Her name was Catherine, he said. She was small and fierce, and she hated Brussels sprouts, and she could make anyone in any room feel like the most important person in the world. She read 3 books a week, and she argued with me about everything, and she was right more often than she was wrong, and I never told her that enough. He stopped. He had not intended to say any of that. He had intended to say something measured and appropriate, something that acknowledged Catherine's memory without exposing the raw, unfinished wound beneath it. But this woman had asked, and the asking had opened a door he had not been able to open for himself. "She sounds wonderful," the woman said softly. She was. And the gardens were hers. Yes. "Then when the weather breaks," she said, "I would very much like to see them." They walked in the gardens in February, when the snow had melted enough to reveal the bones of what Catherine had built. The paths were brick, laid in a herringbone pattern that the woman recognized immediately as a specific historical technique, another fragment of knowledge surfacing from the locked room of her memory. The beds were empty, the roses cut back to gnarled stumps, the arbors bare. But even in its winter skeleton, the garden was beautiful, because the bones of beautiful things are beautiful. And Catherine had built something whose structure was its own kind of grace. They walked side by side, but not touching. The distance between them, about a foot, the width of a garden path, felt as precisely calibrated as the distance between stars. She asked about the plants. He told her. She asked about the arbors and the paths and the small stone bench beside the pond. He told her everything. He told her how Catherine had drawn the plans on the back of old letters, how she had fought with the head gardener about the placement of the roses, how she had insisted on a herb garden that nobody wanted, but everybody ended up using. He told her things he had not said aloud in 2 years, and with each telling, the weight of carrying them alone shifted, not disappearing, but distributing, spreading across 2 sets of shoulders instead of 1. "There," she said, stopping suddenly. She was pointing at a section of the garden wall where the brick had been repaired, a patch about 3 feet square where newer bricks, slightly different in color, replaced older ones. "That was damaged. Something fell against it. A tree, perhaps." He stared at her. "How did you know that?" She blinked. I do not know. I looked at the bricks and I simply knew." She pressed her fingers to her temple. "It is happening more. These small things. I will see something and know something about it, but I cannot trace the knowing back to its source. Like hearing music through a wall. I can tell the melody is there, but I cannot make out the words." That night, Sebastian sat in his study and opened a drawer in his desk. Inside the drawer, beneath a stack of correspondence and a broken pocket watch and a dried sprig of lavender that Catherine had placed there years ago and that he had never been able to remove, there was a document. The provenance record for the painting. He had obtained it when he purchased the piece, and he had read it once and then put it away because it had told him nothing useful. He read it again now. The painting had been purchased at auction from the estate of a family called Whitmore. The Whitmores had been a minor gentry family in the neighboring county, unremarkable in every way except that they had produced, in the middle of the 19th century, a daughter of unusual talent. Her name was Eliza Whitmore. She had studied architecture. She had designed buildings, not the grand public kind, but the intimate, private kind. Garden follies, orangeries, small chapels, the sort of structures that existed not for function, but for beauty. She had been considered eccentric. She had never married. She had disappeared in 1869 at the age of 27 and had never been found. The painting had been among her belongings. Sebastian put down the document. His hands were trembling. Not with fear, with something more complicated. Anticipation, perhaps. Or the feeling a person gets when they realize that the story they are living inside is larger than they understood. Eliza Whitmore, architect, eccentric, disappeared in 1869. The woman upstairs could identify a specific bricklaying technique by sight. She knew when a garden wall had been damaged by a falling tree. She knew about architecture the way someone knows their own name, instinctively, fundamentally, as part of the fabric of who they are. He did not tell her, not yet, because the information was incomplete, and because he was afraid, not of the truth, but of what the truth might mean. If this woman was somehow connected to Eliza Whitmore, then the painting was not a coincidence. And if the painting was not a coincidence, then Sebastian had purchased it 18 months ago, not by chance, but by something else, something that operated outside the machinery of logic and reason, something that had put that painting in front of him and made him want it with a desperation he had not felt since Catherine's death. Something that had brought this woman to his gates. He was not ready to think about what that meant. But time, as it tends to do, did not wait for him to be ready. March arrived, and brought with it two things. The first, crocuses in Catherine's garden, pushing through the frozen ground like small purple fists, and a visitor. The visitor's name was Lord Ashby. He was Sebastian's cousin, 10 years older, considerably wealthier, and possessed of the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He arrived without warning, as was his habit, in a carriage that was too large for the road, and with a manner that was too large for any room. Sebastian received him in the drawing room with the warmth of a man greeting a toothache. "Cousin," Ashby said, settling into the best chair without being invited. "You look terrible. Have you been eating? You look like a scarecrow, someone dressed in expensive clothes." "What do you want, Ashby?" Straight to the point, charming as ever. Ashby crossed his legs, and his boot, polished to such a degree that it reflected the ceiling, caught the light. "I have come about the matter of your succession." "There is no matter of my succession." "There is very much a matter. You are the last of the line, Sebastian. You have no heir. You show no interest in acquiring one. You live alone in this enormous house like a ghost who has not yet realized he is dead. And the estate, which, I remind you, I stand to inherit if you continue on this path, is slowly deteriorating. Is that why you are here? To remind me of your inheritance?" "I am here," Ashby said, leaning forward, "because I have heard a rumor, a rather interesting rumor, that you have a woman living in your house." Sebastian felt his jaw tighten. "I have a guest. A guest with no name, no family, no history." Ashby smiled, and there was something in the smile that Sebastian did not like, a sharpness, a calculation. "You understand how this looks. I do not care how it looks." "You should, because if this woman is, what, a fortune hunter, a madwoman, someone with a past so colorful she has found it convenient to forget, then she is a threat not only to your reputation, but to the estate. And I have a responsibility to the estate." "You have a responsibility to your own ambition. Do not dress it up as duty." Ashby's smile did not waver. "Find out who she is, Sebastian, or I will." He left. Sebastian stood in the drawing room and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not grief, not numbness, not the dull grey weight that had become his constant companion. Anger, sharp, clean, clarifying anger. Because Ashby was right about one thing. The woman had no name, no history, no protection. She was vulnerable in a way that went beyond the physical. In the eyes of society, she did not exist. And people who do not exist can be treated however those in power decide to treat them. He went to find her. She was in the library. She had discovered the library 2 weeks ago, and it had become her home within a home. A large, wood-paneled room with shelves reaching to the ceiling, and a pair of tall windows that looked out onto the garden. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, an entirely improper way to sit, which Mrs. Calloway had mentioned, and which the woman had ignored with a cheerfulness that bordered on defiance. Surrounded by open books and loose papers, and what appeared to be drawings. Sebastian stopped in the doorway. She was drawing buildings, not copying them from books, drawing them from somewhere inside herself. Precise, detailed architectural sketches, elevations and floor plans and perspective drawings, rendered with a skill that was not learned in a week or a month, but over years. She was using a pencil she had borrowed from Mrs. Calloway's desk and the back of old correspondence she had found in a drawer, and she was working with the concentrated focus of someone who has found, after long absence, the thing they were born to do. She looked up. Her eyes were bright, brighter than he had seen them. Something had ignited behind the brown, a light that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the pencil in her hand and the buildings flowing from it. "I can draw," she said. And then, as if the enormity of this simple fact was only now hitting her, "I can draw. I see that. Look." She held up a sketch. It was an orangery, a glass and iron structure, delicate and strong simultaneously. The kind of building that existed to let light in and keep cold out. It was beautiful. I do not remember drawing anything before this moment, but my hand knows. My hand remembers even if I do not. He knelt beside her. He looked at the drawings spread across the floor. An orangery, a garden folly, a small chapel with arched windows and climbing roses drawn into the masonry, as if the building and the garden were the same living thing. "These are remarkable," he said, and he meant it. He was not a man who offered praise easily or often, and the word landed with the weight of something earned. She looked at him. They were very close, closer than they had ever been. He could see the exact texture of the crescent scar above her eyebrow, the individual threads of copper in her dark hair, the way her lower lip was slightly fuller than the upper. He could smell pencil graphite and paper, and the lavender soap Mrs. Calloway had given her. "Something is coming back," she said. "Not memories, not yet, but something underneath the memories. The things I am made of, the skills, the instincts, I do not have a better word for it, the architecture of who I am." "The architecture," he repeated, and felt the word resonate in a way she could not yet understand. "It is as if my mind was a house and someone emptied all the rooms, but the rooms themselves are still there, the walls, the doorways, the staircases, and I am walking through them in the dark, finding things by touch." He wanted to tell her about Eliza Whitmore. He wanted to tell her about the painting. He wanted to open every locked door in this mystery and let the light in. But he also wanted to protect her, from the shock, from the confusion, from the possibility that the truth, when it came, might be something so strange that it would shatter the fragile stability she had built. "I need to tell you something," he said instead. "My cousin came today. He has learned that you are here. He is not kind, and he may make inquiries of his own. If he discovers anything about your past, he will use it not to help you, but to serve himself." Her eyes darkened, not with fear, with something harder. "What does he want?" "The estate. He inherits if I have no heir. A woman living in my house without name or explanation is, in his view, either a scandal to be exploited or a threat to be removed." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very calmly, "Then we should find out who I am before he does." "Yes." "You said you sent inquiries. They found nothing." "Nothing." She picked up one of her drawings, the orangery. She looked at it as if it were a mirror, and what she saw reflected there was not her face, but herself, the parts of herself that her hands remembered even when her mind did not. "Then we look differently," she said. "We follow what my hands know. Architecture, design, these drawings. Someone somewhere taught me these things. Someone somewhere knows who I am." It was a good plan, a logical plan, a plan that treated the mystery of her identity as a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be feared. And it almost worked. They began the search. Sebastian wrote to architectural firms, to universities, to anyone who might recognize the style of the drawings. He described the woman's skills, her knowledge of historical bricklaying techniques, Her instinct for structural design, her ability to draw an orangery from memory that looked as if it belonged in a professional portfolio. He was careful not to describe her appearance. Not yet. The painting hung in his study, face down against the wall again, a secret he kept not out of dishonesty, but out of a helpless, aching desire to protect her from a truth he did not yet understand. Meanwhile, the woman explored the house. She moved through Ashworth Hall the way she had described moving through the rooms of her own mind. Carefully, attentively, in the dark, but with hands outstretched. She found things. In the cellar, she identified a type of stone foundation work that she said was characteristic of the early 18th century. In the attic, she noticed that the roof beams had been replaced at some point, and she could tell the new wood from the old by its grain. In the west wing, she stood in an unused room and said, without any apparent source for the knowledge, "This wall is load-bearing. If you ever wanted to renovate this wing, you would need to reinforce it before removing anything." Sebastian watched her. He could not help it. She moved through his house, his cold, silent, grief-haunted house, and she brought it back to life, not through warmth or laughter alone, but through attention. She saw the house. She saw what it was, what it had been, what it could be. And in seeing it, she somehow saw him too. The parallel was not lost on either of them. He was a house that had been emptied of everything except its structure. She was a person who understood structures. One evening in late March, they were sitting in the library after dinner. This had become a habit, a dangerous, wonderful, inevitable habit. She would read. He would pretend to read. They would talk, and the talking would grow easier and deeper each night, like a path being worn smooth by the passage of feet. "I dreamed last night," she said. He lowered his book. "What did you dream?" "A house. Not this one. Smaller, made of warm stone. There was a garden, and in the garden there was a woman painting at an easel. I could not see her face, but I felt that I loved her, that she was important to me, that she was the reason I understood buildings. Your mother, perhaps. Perhaps." She was quiet. Then, in the dream, the woman turned to look at me, and she said, "Remember the orangery." And then I woke. Remember the orangery. Sebastian thought of the sketch she had drawn, the glass and iron structure, so precise it could have been built from the plans. He thought of Eliza Whitmore, who had designed orangeries and garden follies and small chapels. He thought of the painting, 24 years old, bearing a face identical to the face of the woman sitting 3 feet from him. "I need to show you something," he said. He had reached the limit of what he could keep from her. The secret was no longer a protection. It was a wall between them, and there had been enough walls. He stood. She stood. He led her to the study. He crossed to the painting, which still faced the wall, and he turned it around. She looked at it. The sound she made was not a gasp and not a cry. It was a breath, a single, sharp inhalation, as if the air had been knocked from her lungs by something she had not seen coming. She stepped forward. She raised her bandaged hand. The bandages were lighter now, the frostbite nearly healed, the fingers beneath them pink and whole. And she touched the frame. Not the canvas, the frame. As if she was afraid that touching the image itself might break something. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "At auction, 18 months ago. From the estate of a family called Whitmore." Whitmore. The provenance record says it was among the belongings of a woman named Eliza Whitmore. She was an architect. She designed buildings, orangeries, follies, chapels. She was considered eccentric. She disappeared in 1869. The painting is dated 1868. The woman stared at the painting. The woman in the painting stared back. The same face. The same scar. The same eyes that held an expression somewhere between a smile and sadness, somewhere between knowing and unknowing. "This is not possible," she said. "No. This painting is 24 years old." "Yes. I am not 24 years old. I do not know how old I am, but I am not this painting." "No." She turned to him. Her eyes were wide, and in them was something he had not seen before. Not fear, not confusion, but a terrible, trembling hope. As if the impossible thing she was looking at was not a mystery to be solved, but an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. "Eliza Whitmore," she said. "She designed orangeries." "Yes." "She was an architect." "Yes." "She disappeared." "Yes." The woman looked back at the painting. She studied it the way she studied buildings, with that precise, structural attention, looking not at the surface, but at what held the surface up, what gave it its shape and its strength. "She was my mother," the woman said. "I do not know how I know this, but she was my mother. The woman in my dream, the one who said, 'Remember the orangery.' She looked like this. She looked exactly like this. And she taught me everything." She sat down, not gracefully, simply folded, as if her legs had decided they were finished supporting her for the time being. She sat on the floor of Sebastian's study, beside the painting that bore her mother's face and her own, and she pressed her hands against the carpet and breathed. Sebastian knelt beside her. He did not touch her. He wanted to. He wanted to take her hands, or press his hand against her back, or do anything at all to close the distance between them. But the distance was hers. She was the one navigating the darkness of her own mind, and he would not rush her steps. "Eliza Whitmore disappeared in 1869, she said, thinking aloud, her voice steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking is holding themselves together through sheer force of will. If she was 27 when she disappeared, and she had a child, if she had me, then she would have had to survive her disappearance. She would have had to go somewhere, start a new life, raise a daughter. She would have had to give up everything, her name, her family, her work, in order to keep me. Or to keep herself safe, Sebastian said quietly. People disappear for reasons. Yes. She looked at him. What if she was running from something? What if whatever she was running from is what I am running from? What if I did not lose my memory? What if it was taken? What if someone... She stopped. Her eyes went wide, and Sebastian watched something move across her face. Not a memory, not quite, but the shadow of one. A shape moving beneath dark water. "There was a man," she said, and her voice changed. It went thin and tight, like a string being wound to the point of breaking. "I cannot see his face, but I can feel being afraid of him. I can feel running. Snow. I remember the snow. I remember being cold and being afraid and running towards something, toward a light in a window." His study window, the lamp he had left burning, the single lit window in the dark face of Ashworth Hall, visible from the gate. "You ran here," he said. "I ran toward the light," she said. "Toward your light." The silence that followed was so complete that he could hear the fire settling in the grate, the wind outside, the distant ticking of the hall clock, and beneath all of it, the sound of something shifting between them. The last wall, the thinnest wall, the one made not of stone or ice or grief, but of the simple, terrifying space between two people who are about to stop pretending they are anything less than essential to each other. "I'm going to find out what happened to you," he said. "I'm going to find out who you are, and who Eliza Whitmore was, and why you came to my gate, and why your face has been hanging in my study for 18 months, as if it was waiting for you to arrive. I'm going to do this because it is the right thing to do, and also He stopped, started again. And also because I cannot bear the thought of you being afraid, and me not knowing why. She looked at him for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the glass. The painting watched them both with its knowing, ancient, 24-year-old eyes. "You are a strange man," she said again, the same words she had used the first evening in the blue room. But they meant something different now. They meant, "I see you. I see what you are doing. I see that you are opening doors you boarded shut 2 years ago, and I know what it is costing you, and I am not going to pretend I do not see." "So I have been told," he said. The same words, different meaning. I know what this is, and I am choosing it anyway." The investigation into Eliza Whitmore's disappearance took Sebastian to London. He did not want to go. Leaving Ashworth Hall meant leaving her, and leaving her felt, for the first time in 2 years, like leaving home rather than like leaving a prison. But the answers were not in the countryside. They were in archives, in records, in the offices of solicitors who had handled the Whitmore estate. He went. He spent a week in London, moving through dusty offices and dimly lit record rooms with the focused intensity of a man on a mission that mattered more than he was willing to say aloud. What he found was this. Eliza Whitmore had not simply disappeared. She had been declared mad. In 1869, her family, specifically her elder brother, Gerald Whitmore, had petitioned to have her committed to an asylum. The grounds were her unnatural interest in architecture, her refusal to marry, and her persistent and willful defiance of her natural role as a woman. The petition was approved. Eliza was to be collected and taken to an institution in the north. But the night before she was to be taken, she vanished. Gerald Whitmore had searched for her for years. He had hired investigators, placed notices, offered rewards. He had never found her. He had died in 1882, and the estate had passed to a distant cousin who had sold off everything, including the painting, without much interest in who the original owners had been. But Gerald Whitmore had had a son named Thomas Whitmore, who had inherited his father's obsession with finding Eliza, and with finding whatever Eliza might have left behind. Because Eliza, before she fled, had been working on something. A commission, a design, something important enough that her papers referred to it only as the project. And the project, whatever it was, had never been found. Thomas Whitmore was 50 years old. He lived in the neighboring county. He was still looking. Sebastian returned to Ashworth Hall with a cold certainty settling in his chest, like a stone in deep water. Someone had been looking for Eliza Whitmore for 23 years. And if Eliza had had a daughter who looked exactly like her, who shared her skills, who carried her knowledge in her very hands, then that daughter would be worth finding. Not for love, for whatever Eliza had been working on, for the project. The woman was waiting for him in the library. She was standing by the window, and the late afternoon light was coming through the glass and turning her hair to copper and amber. And when she turned to look at him, the expression on her face was one he had never seen on anyone before, and would never see on anyone again. It was the expression of someone who has spent a week missing someone they have known for 2 months, and is only now realizing that the duration of knowing is irrelevant to the depth of it. "You came back," she said. "Of course I came back." She crossed the room. She did not stop at the usual distance, the careful, calibrated, socially appropriate distance that they had maintained for weeks. She crossed it. She came close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat, the rise and fall of her breathing, the tiny variations in the brown of her eyes. "I remembered something while you were gone," she said. "What?" "My name." Her voice broke on the word, just slightly, just enough to reveal the enormity of what it had cost her to reach this moment. "I was sitting in the garden, in Catherine's garden, and I was looking at the crocuses, and I heard her voice. My mother's voice, saying my name, calling me in from the garden, and I remembered. Sebastian could not breathe. Not would not, could not. The air in his lungs had turned to something solid, something that would not move. My name is Clara, she said. Clara Whitmore. Clara. The name settled into the room like a bell being struck. It filled the space. It changed the shape of everything. Clara, he said, and the word in his mouth felt like the first true thing he had said in 2 years. She told him what she had remembered. Not everything. The door in her mind had opened only a crack, letting in a shaft of light rather than a flood. But through that crack she could see pieces. A cottage. A woman who painted and who taught her to draw buildings. A childhood spent in hiding, moving from place to place, never using their real name. A mother who was afraid of someone finding them. A mother who died when Clara was 18, whispering, "Do not let them find the project." "What is the project?" Sebastian asked. "I do not know. I cannot remember. But it mattered to her. It was the thing she was most afraid of losing, and the thing she was most afraid of being found." He told her what he had learned in London. He told her about Gerald Whitmore's petition, about the asylum, about the flight in the night. He told her about Thomas Whitmore, Gerald's son, who was still searching, and he watched her face as she absorbed each piece, watched the puzzle assemble behind her eyes, watched her go pale and then steady, pale and then steady, like a ship rolling in heavy seas. "Thomas Whitmore," she said. "The man I was running from. The man in my memory. The one I could not see. It was him. He found me. I do not know how, but he found me, and I ran." "You ran here?" "To the light." He reached for her hand. It was the first time he had touched her intentionally. Not the accidental brush of fingers over a past book, not the professional contact of helping her over an icy step. This was a choice. His hand reaching for hers, his fingers closing around hers, his skin against her skin. And the contact, warm, solid, real, sent a current through both of them that had been building since the night he had knelt in the snow and lifted her from the ground. She did not pull away. "He will come here," she said. "If he found me once, he will find me again." "Let him come." "Sebastian." It was the first time she had used his name, not his title, his name. And the sound of it, her voice shaping those 3 syllables with an intimacy that no amount of formality could have achieved, landed in his chest like a hand pressed against his heart. "Let him come," he said again. "This is my house. You are under my protection, and I am not the man I was 2 years ago." "What man were you 2 years ago?" "A man with nothing left to protect." She looked at him. She looked at their joined hands. She said, very quietly, "I remember one more thing." "What?" "The orangery. The project my mother was working on when she was declared mad. It was not a building. It was plans for a building. An orangery that she designed for a great estate in the county of Ashworth. She was commissioned in 1868 by the 4th Duke of Ashworth to design it, and when she was declared mad before she could deliver the plans, the commission was lost. But she never stopped working on it. She carried the plans with her. She revised them for 20 years. They were her masterwork, the thing that proved she was not mad, that her talent was real, that she had been wronged. Sebastian felt the world tilt. The 4th Duke. My grandfather. Yes. My grandfather commissioned your mother to design an orangery for this estate. Yes. And the plans are somewhere. Somewhere she hid them. Somewhere she thought they would be safe. They looked at each other. And in that look was the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. A painting purchased on an inexplicable impulse, a storm that drove a woman to his gates, a locked memory that opened in a dead woman's garden, a thread connecting his family to hers across 3 generations. Not coincidence, not fate, something in between. Something that felt like the architecture of the universe itself, as if the world were a building and someone had designed this moment into its plans. Thomas Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday. He came not in a carriage but on horseback, alone, at the kind of hour, very early morning, just past dawn, that suggested he did not care about propriety and did not expect to be welcomed. He was a tall man, thin, with the particular leanness of someone who has been consumed by a single purpose for so long that everything unnecessary has been burned away. His face was narrow and sharp, with the Whitmore features that Clara carried, the same jaw, the same brow. But in him, they had been hardened into something that looked more like a blade than a face. Sebastian met him at the door. He had been expecting him. He had, in fact, been preparing for him, in the quiet, methodical way that the Duke of Ashworth prepared for everything, by thinking 3 steps ahead and showing none of it on his face. "Lord Ashby sends his regards," Thomas Whitmore said, standing on the steps, making no move to come inside. "He told me I might find something of interest here." Sebastian felt the anger again, clean and sharp. Ashby, of course. Ashby, who stood to inherit the estate. Ashby, who saw Clara as either a scandal to exploit or a pawn to play. Ashby had sent this man here. "You are Thomas Whitmore," Sebastian said. A flicker of surprise crossed the narrow face. "You know my name?" "I know a great many things. I know your grandfather had your Aunt Eliza committed for the crime of being talented. I know your father spent years hunting her like an animal. I know you have continued the tradition. And I know what you want." Thomas Whitmore's expression did not change. "Then you know I want only what belongs to my family. Eliza Whitmore's plans, her work. It is Whitmore property." "Eliza Whitmore's work belongs to Eliza Whitmore." "Eliza Whitmore is dead." "Then it belongs to her daughter." Another silence. Thomas Whitmore's eyes moved past Sebastian, toward the interior of the house, as if he could see through walls to the woman inside. "So there is a daughter," he said softly. "I was not certain. I tracked her to the county. I found her at a cottage near the village. She ran before I could speak with her, into the storm." He paused. "I did not intend for her to come to harm. And yet she nearly froze to death at my gates. I am not a violent man, Your Grace. I am a patient one. I have been searching for 23 years. I simply want the plans." "Why?" "Because they are worth a fortune. Eliza Whitmore was a genius. Her designs were decades ahead of their time. The orangery she designed for your grandfather's estate, if those plans were published, if the structure were built, it would establish the Whitmore name in the architectural world. It would prove that my family produced greatness, not madness." "Your family produced both," Sebastian said. "The greatness was your aunt's. The madness was your grandfather's, who tried to lock her away for it. You have inherited the wrong part of the legacy, Mr. Whitmore." Thomas Whitmore's jaw tightened. "The plans belong to the Whitmore family. The plans belong to Clara." Clara. He said the name as if tasting it. She remembers then. She remembers enough. "I would like to speak with her." "No." The word fell between them like a gate closing. Thomas Whitmore looked at Sebastian, at the set of his shoulders, the steel in his eyes, the absolute immovability of a man who had lost everything once, and had found, against all expectation, something worth protecting again. "This is not finished," Thomas Whitmore said. "No," Sebastian agreed. "It is not. But you will not finish it here. And you will not finish it today. And you will not come near her unless she invites you to." Thomas Whitmore left. Sebastian stood on the steps and watched him ride away, and the cold morning air against his face felt like the cold of the night he had knelt in the snow and lifted Clara from the ground. And he thought, I will not lose this. Whatever this is, I will not lose it. He went inside. He went to the library. Clara was there. She had heard everything. The library windows overlooked the front steps, and she had stood behind the curtain and listened to every word, because she was not the kind of woman who hid in a room and waited for a man to tell her what had happened. She was the kind of woman who found her own information and drew her own conclusions. Thank you, she said. He will be back. I know. We need to find the plans before he does. I know that too. She paused. I think I know where they are. He stared at her. The orangery, she said. My mother designed an orangery for this estate. She never delivered the plans because she was forced to flee, but she carried them with her for 20 years. She revised them. She perfected them. And when she died, she told me to keep them safe, to not let them find the project. Clara walked to the window. She looked out at the garden, Catherine's garden, dormant and waiting for spring. My mother was a woman who thought in buildings. She did not hide things in obvious places. She hid them in structures, in the architecture itself. You think she hid the plans in a building? I think she hid the plans in this building, in Ashworth Hall. I think she came here at some point in the 20 years she was in hiding, and I think she concealed the plans inside the house her orangery was meant to be built beside, because this was where they belonged. This was their home. It took them 3 days. 3 days of searching, of Clara walking through every room with her architect's eyes, examining walls and floors and ceilings with the precision of a surgeon and the instinct of a daughter who carried her mother's knowledge in her very bones. Sebastian followed her. He held the lamp. He moved furniture when she asked. He said little, because what was happening required not his words, but his presence, and he gave that freely. On the 3rd day, she found it. It was in the cellar, behind a section of wall that Clara identified as newer than the surrounding stone, not by decades, but by years. Someone had opened the wall and closed it again, carefully, skillfully, in a way that only an architect would recognize as different from the original construction. Clara ran her fingers along the mortar. She pressed. She found the seam. Behind the stone, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio were the plans. Dozens of pages, drawn in a hand that was both like Clara's and unlike it. The same precision, the same instinct for beauty, but with a confidence that came from a full lifetime of practice, rather than the fragments of one. The orangery was breathtaking. Even on paper, even in pencil and ink, it was the most beautiful building Sebastian had ever seen. A structure of glass and iron that seemed to grow from the earth like a living thing, its proportions so perfect that looking at the plans felt less like looking at a design and more like looking at something inevitable, something that had always been meant to exist. Clara held the plans in her hands, her mother's work. The thing that had cost Eliza Whitmore everything, her freedom, her family, her name, her life as she had known it, and had given her the only thing that mattered, proof that she was real, that her talent was real, that she had been wronged and she had survived, and she had created something that the world could not ignore. They are magnificent, Clara said. Her voice was steady, her eyes were not. She was magnificent. Sebastian looked at the plans. He looked at Clara. He made a decision. Build it, he said. She turned to him. Build it, he repeated. Here, on this estate, where it was always meant to be. Build your mother's orangery, not for the Whitmore name, for Eliza, for you. And Clara, who had come to his gates without a name or a memory or a single thing in the world except the knowledge in her hands, looked at the Duke of Ashworth and said the word that changed everything. Yes. She built it. Through spring and summer, she built it. She hired craftsmen from the village. She sourced the iron and the glass. She stood on the site her mother had chosen, a gentle slope beside the east garden, facing the morning sun. And she directed the construction with the authority of a woman who had found not only her name, but her purpose. She wore practical clothes and boots caked with mud, and she carried rolled-up plans under her arm, and she argued with stonemasons about load-bearing walls. And she was, Sebastian thought, the most remarkable person he had ever known. He watched her. He watched from his study window, from the garden path, from the bench beside Catherine's pond. He watched the way she moved through the construction site, with a certainty that had nothing to do with memory, and everything to do with identity, with knowing, at the deepest level, what she was and what she was for. And he watched the orangery rise. It rose from the earth like a promise kept. The iron framework went up first, a skeleton of graceful curves and precise angles that caught the light and threw patterns across the ground. Then the glass, panel by panel, each one fitted with a care that bordered on reverence. The walls went up. The door was hung. The first plants were brought in, citrus trees and flowering vines and herbs that filled the interior with a fragrance that was warm and green and alive. On the day the orangery was completed, Clara stood inside it and looked up through the glass at the sky. The sun came through and touched her face and her hair and her hands, and she was, in that moment, standing inside her mother's masterwork, inside the building that Eliza Whitmore had carried in her heart for 20 years, the building that had been called madness and was, in truth, genius. Sebastian stood in the doorway. He did not come in. He wanted to, but the moment belonged to Clara and to Eliza, to a daughter and a mother, separated by death, but united by the thing they had built together across time. Clara turned to him. The sun was behind her, and the light through the glass turned the world green and gold and warm. "Come in," she said. He came in. They stood together in the orangery, surrounded by glass and iron and living things, and the air between them was warm and fragrant, and charged with everything they had not yet said. 2 months of careful distance. 2 months of conversations that circled closer and closer to the center, without quite arriving. 2 months of hands that almost touched, and eyes that held too long, and silences that said more than any words could. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I know." "No, you do not." She took a breath. "When I first saw the painting of my mother, I felt something that I did not tell you about. I felt that I had seen it before. Not the painting itself, the scene of it. My mother, sitting in a garden, looking at someone with that expression, that almost smile. And I realized, standing in your study, that the expression on her face was the expression of a woman looking at someone she loved." Sebastian did not move, did not breathe. "I have spent my entire life inside my mother's work," Clara continued. "Inside her buildings, her drawings, her plans. But I never understood the most important thing she built until now. She did not build the orangery for your grandfather. She built it for herself. Because building was how she loved the world. Building was how she proved that she existed, that she mattered, that she was not mad or wrong or broken. And when I stand here, in this building, I understand that. Because building this orangery is how I have proved the same thing to myself." She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her through the warm air. "And you," she said, "you carried me out of the snow. You gave me a room in your empty house. You showed me the painting. You fought for me against your own family. You told me to build. And I need you to know, I need you to understand, that you are not just the man who saved my life. You are the light I ran toward. You have been the light since the beginning." He reached for her. Not her hand this time, her face, His fingers, trembling in a way they had not trembled when he carried her through the snow or faced Thomas Whitmore on his own steps, touched her cheek. The crescent scar beneath his thumb, the warmth of her skin, the reality of her, solid and present and here in this building of glass and light, here in his life. Here. "I bought that painting," he said, and his voice was rough and unsteady, and more honest than it had ever been. "Because when I looked at it, I felt something I had not felt since Catherine died. I felt that the world contained something I had not yet found. I did not know what it was. I did not know it was you. But the feeling of something waiting, something coming, something meant. It kept me alive, Clara. Through 2 years of grief and silence and wanting to disappear. That painting kept me alive. You kept me alive before I ever knew you existed." She pressed her hand against his hand, against her own cheek. Her eyes were bright. The orangery held them in its glass embrace, and the light poured through, and outside the sky was the blue of early autumn, not the grey of storm clouds or the white of snow, but the blue of something opening, something beginning. "I am going to kiss you now," she said. "I was hoping you would." And she did, and it was not gentle, not tentative. She kissed him like a woman who had walked through the dark for months and had finally found the door. And he kissed her back, like a man who had been standing on the other side of that door for 2 years, waiting, his hand on the handle, his heart pressed against the wood, listening for footsteps. Thomas Whitmore came back. Of course he did. He came with a solicitor and acclaimed that the plans were Whitmore family property, and he stood in Sebastian's drawing room and made his case with the cold precision of a man who had been preparing his argument for 23 years. And Clara, wearing the dove-grey dress that was now her own rather than borrowed, stood beside Sebastian and dismantled him. She dismantled him not with anger and not with tears, but with facts, with documents that Sebastian had obtained in London, proving that Gerald Whitmore's petition had been fraudulent, that Eliza had not been mad, that the declaration had been made without proper medical examination, that the real motivation had been control of her work and her inheritance. With a letter from the 4th Duke of Ashworth, Sebastian's grandfather, found in the estate archives, praising Eliza's designs and explicitly stating that the commission was Eliza's personal work, not Whitmore family property. With the testimony of Dr. Ellis, who confirmed that Clara's amnesia was consistent with a traumatic pursuit and that her recovery had been made possible by safety and care, not coercion. Thomas Whitmore's solicitor looked at the documents. He looked at Thomas. He closed his case. "You have nothing," Clara said to Thomas Whitmore. "Your grandfather tried to lock my mother in an asylum because she was brilliant and he could not control her. Your father hunted her for decades. You hunted me. And for what? For plans that were never yours. For talent that was never yours. For a legacy that you could not earn, so you tried to steal." Thomas Whitmore was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She was my aunt. I never knew her. I only knew the story of her. And the story I was told was that she was ill, that she needed help, that my grandfather was trying to protect her. The story you were told was a lie." "I am beginning to understand that." He left. He did not come back. And in the years that followed, the Whitmore name faded into the kind of obscurity that comes not from tragedy, but from irrelevance, while the name Eliza Whitmore, architect, designer, genius, was published in journals and discussed in universities and printed on a brass plate that hung beside the entrance to the most beautiful orangery in England. They married in October, in the orangery, because where else would they marry? Mrs. Calloway organized the flowers, Barrow polished the door handles, Nelson the cat sat on a chair in the front row and washed his paw through the entire ceremony with an air of elaborate indifference. Sebastian's brother, James, stood as best man, and cried more than anyone else present, including the bride, which he attributed to dust. Clara wore a green dress, not because she had remembered the painting, she had, but because green was the color of growing things, of new things, of buildings made of glass that let the light in. Sebastian wore a look on his face that Mrs. Calloway had been waiting 23 years to see. Not the look of a man in love, though he was that. Not the look of a man who had found happiness, though he had found that too. It was the look of a man who had come back to life. The look of a man standing in a house that he had boarded up and shuttered and left for dead, and someone had come along and opened every window, and the light was pouring in, and the rooms were full again. "I do not deserve this," he whispered to Clara during the ceremony, low enough that only she could hear. "That is not for you to decide," she whispered back. And that was the last time he said it. Lord Ashby attended the wedding. He sat in the back row with the expression of a man who has just realized that his inheritance has evaporated and is trying to maintain his dignity while doing the mathematics. Sebastian would have an heir. The estate would continue. Ashby's 20-year investment in Sebastian's misery had yielded exactly nothing. Clara caught him on the way out. "Lord Ashby," she said, with a smile that was precise and devastating. "Thank you for sending Thomas Whitmore to our door. If not for your interference, I might never have discovered my family's history. I am in your debt." Ashby stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He got in his carriage and left. The years that followed were not perfect. They were better than perfect. They were real. Clara opened an architectural practice, the first woman to do so in the county, which caused exactly the kind of scandal she had been born to cause. She designed buildings, not grand public ones, but the intimate, private kind, like her mother before her. Orangeries, garden rooms, libraries, small chapels filled with light. She designed a school for the village that had more windows than walls, and that the children loved so much they had to be dragged out of it at the end of each day. She designed a cottage hospital with rooms that faced the sunrise and gardens that patients could see from their beds. She designed a home for herself and Sebastian and the family that was growing, an extension to Ashworth Hall, warm stone and wide windows, a nursery that caught the morning light. Sebastian ran the estate, but he ran it differently now. The tenants noticed first. Repairs that had been postponed were suddenly completed. Rents that had been raised were lowered. The old greenhouse that had stood empty for a decade was rebuilt and filled with the citrus trees that Clara loved. He was still quiet. He was still serious. He was still the kind of man whose approval came in the form of a single nod rather than a standing ovation. But the walls were down. The windows were open. The light was in. On a morning in the 3rd year of their marriage, Sebastian came downstairs to find Clara in the orangery. It was early, barely past dawn, and the light was the soft gold of new sun, filtered through glass, and the citrus trees were heavy with fruit, and Clara was sitting on the stone bench that had been part of her mother's original design, reading a letter. "It is from a university," she said when he sat down beside her. "They want to publish Eliza's plans. All of them. They want to include them in a book about women architects of the 19th century. Sebastian took her hand, the hand that had been frostbitten and bandaged, that had drawn buildings on the back of old letters, that had held his face in an orangery and told him he was her light. "She would be proud," he said. "She is proud," Clara said, and looked up through the glass, and the sun came through and touched her face. The face from the painting, the face from the snow, the face that he had known before he knew her, and would know long after he had forgotten everything else. He kissed her temple. She leaned into him. The orangery held them in its light, and outside, in Catherine's garden, the roses were blooming. There was a time, not so long ago, when the Duke of Ashworth believed that love was something that happened once and then was taken away, like a book borrowed from a library and returned before you finished the story. He believed that the best a person could do, after that, was to build walls strong enough that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. and to live inside those walls in a silence so complete that it became indistinguishable from peace. He was wrong. Love is not a book. It is a building. It is built with hands that shake, and plans that change, and materials that sometimes fail. It is built in storms and in sunlight, on ground that is not always steady, against winds that are not always kind. It is built by people who do not know the ending, but who keep building anyway, because the alternative, the silence, the empty rooms, the walls with no windows, is no kind of life at all. He found her freezing at his gates. She could not remember her name. He could not forget her face. And together, they built something that the world could not ignore.